Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you again. A very mixed audience, people from the department and people from beyond. It's always nice to have a good mixture of people. This is the last year's seminar of this term. I think it's the sixth or maybe the seventh this term, and a good range of presentations on a range of topics that relate to the kind of stuff that we do in the department, the sort of things that interest us in terms of heritage and landscape and conservation and so on. And today it's Tim Schadla-Hall, Tim from the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, making his third visit to York in 6 days. And so Tim's very closely involved in the Schadla-Hall project and has been for a long time. And also working at Boynton out here, Bridlington as well, and involved in the publication of that at the moment. Involved in a number of things, has been for a number of years, was at UCL, has been at UCL for 13 years or so, and before that worked with the Leicestershire Museum Service and various other organisations. So it's with great pleasure really that I can introduce Tim. And Tim tonight is going to talk about various issues relating to cultural heritage and public archaeology in a talk entitled Talking to Ourselves.
Thank you very much. Right, well, thank you for turning out tonight. I'll do my best. It has been a difficult week. When I set this up, John gave me plenty of days to say I had to come here tonight and talk to you. And then I kept on changing it, as you do, when you're thinking about preparing a presentation for a distinguished audience. So let me start off. This is my slide, so I'm quite safe. Talking about pale, male, stale archaeologists talking to themselves. Because one of my primary concerns tonight is about communication and what we do. Because when I started, as usual, I was thinking about the things that concern me about the public understanding. I've never wanted to get engaged, so I tend not to use public engagement. But talking about the issues of communication that worry me, and about the nature of archaeology, which is what I am, in a wider world, and also trying to make points about the dreaded creep of cultural heritage, which I shall attack later on tonight, because I think it's important that I make clear my position, and that means in turn, as there's no such thing as private archaeology, which is something that I think many of my colleagues forget, that I'm going to sort of deal with a whole series of things that I hope are happening. But also, I want to talk specifically about the fact that what you do in, say, this country doesn't apply to the rest of the world. And therefore, we should be very careful about the way that we communicate and use the past. And I just put this up because I think everybody's fascinated by the past, one way or another. The 3-generation model that so many people put up and say people could only think that far back is not one that I accept. And I've been looking recently, and I wasn't going to do it, but with a number of colleagues, at the growth of local archaeological societies, the decline, for example, of both regional, county, and national archaeological societies in this country, and their steady replacement, partly aided possibly by funding from the HLF, with community involvement and community archaeology. I don't really think community archaeology is separate from public archaeology, and that whole business about people increasingly engaging, sorry I used the word engaging, increasingly becoming involved with the past around them. And actually there are 2 separate sets of people who get involved with the past around them. People who are incomers, pretty university lecturers who retire somewhere and tell everybody else locally what their landscape's about, and actually the people who understand their landscape and their archaeology. So that was part of the theme tonight. And then of course you start with a plan. And I had a brilliant plan for this presentation, which is outlined on the top of this slide, quickly followed by reality and trying to work out what I would do in the 55 minutes that John has allotted me. It's always difficult. So the one thing I want to make absolutely clear at the outset is that what I'm going to say tonight does require a sense of humour. And I particularly recommend you, if you've got time, to look at the Dog Archaeologist magazine, because it makes the point that archaeology is fun. It's not a serious matter, but it's something that people need to enjoy at all costs. Good magazine, that. Anyway, so let me start off by, because I have to do this, by reminding myself and you about Peter Archaeology. Peter Archaeology was a hero of mine, and still is a hero of mine, even though he's long dead. He's one of the most difficult people I ever met, but he was also brilliant. And it was Peter who set up the public archaeology course that I'm now involved with. And it's just worth going into this because, and I'm not advertising for these people archaeology, but Archaeology decided in 1998, it's very interesting, that all undergraduates, even if they did Egyptology, would go on a compulsory public archaeology course. I could deal with the jokes involved in setting that up, but I won't. No matter what they did, they had to go to that course because he wanted people to be aware of a wider archaeology. At the same time, he set up the MA in public archaeology, and he also developed or set up a journal. And I'm not going to talk about that either tonight because that would take a whole right. But I wanted to just look at definitions of public archaeology very quickly because they are worth considering. The term was originally used by Walter R. McKinsey III. Therefore, he must have been a USian, right? I have to say USian because when we talk about the public, I have to remember that all my South American students get very upset if I refer to North Americans as Americans. They say, what about the rest of the continent? Quite important to be aware of that. But actually, McKinsey, and I think it's a US continuing development, McKinsey was primarily involved in protection of the past, and he was also concerned about legal constraints and how professionals would do it. There is one term I really hate. So people come up and say, I'm a heritage professional. I don't know what it means, I think it's disgusting. But I'll come back to the issue later. I am not a heritage professional. Archaeology was particularly concerned at the time, and it's very important, with the matter of both multiple archaeologies and particularly the importance of considering indigenous people. For all sorts of reasons, that was, of course, one of the things he was concerned about, and he was actually great fun on it. I remember Mike Parker Pearson saying to me when we were in South Africa one year, why aren't you at the indigenous people's breakfast, Tim? We go, what do you mean? He said, well, you claim to be a Yorkshireman, and there is actually something to be said about what we mean by the term inherit. Never mind. My personal view is that public archaeology is something where anywhere where archaeology comes into contact with any areas of public interest. Then there's been a whole series of writings since. I particularly recommend Ruben Grima and Akira Matsuda, who is currently at UEA in Norwich. But I also think it's important not to be too clear about definitions. Definitions change through time. As long as they can stick with that core, it will be fine. And it's interesting that the McKinsey line, and it's the USian line, is all about, see, I put it down the bottom, it's all about the Valletta Convention, which is, thank God, not accepted completely in this country, because otherwise we'd be doing anybody from the public out of involvement. And secondly, the cultural resource management area, term that was originally used by Professor Peter Fowler, in literature in this country. Anyway, so we sort of quickly just go through two approaches to public archaeology, and at this stage I want to say that these slides are a production by Dr. Akira Matsuda, so that I can prove I borrowed them legally. Okay, so basically, originally Akira was saying, well, let's look at, what we do. We've got two possible approaches, outreach and multi-vote. And he defined them, right? It's important again, as the aim to communicate information from archaeological studies to the public in the most effective way. That's basically a top-down approach, which actually we do by controlling information and knowledge and not allowing other people to use it analytically. And then we have what he would say is the multi-voter approach. Now, there's more to it than this, which I'm possibly not going to deal with, but the outreach approach is well known to university departments all over the world, and it's basically classifying chemical composition, all those things that we love, dating, distribution, analysis, etc., and actually doing it from the top outwards. I think that's a terrible mistake. And then we have the multi-vocal approach, where we get rid of that stuff, although we can still do it, and we look at it. I hope Kira will forgive me for doing his presentation in this way, as all the people who are involved in what we do. So, you know, we'll put them all in. Politicians, I'll come back to that. Landowners, I love landowners. Tourists, and of course, what Kira defines as the wider public. Now, these two approaches are, it's more subtle than that when we talk about what we're doing. The analysis doesn't really work that way. I'm sorry, but the point is that a multi-vocal approach isn't top-down. We need to be somewhere in the middle about what we're doing. I'm aware of the fact that if we're going to turn out MAs and PhDs in archaeology, those people will need jobs and they will not all be in university in the future as universities slowly decline. But I'm also worried about what we do at universities today in terms of preparing people for wider work. There are other areas that are connected with public archaeology, which I just put up on this list because I couldn't resist it. Cultural heritage, what does it mean? It means all things to all people. I'm writing to UCL at the moment about that. And then we've got this wonderful thing called, which we churn out and regularly, called cultural heritage management. As far as I'm concerned, that's rich Westerners trying to impose their views of the past, of the Western world, through bureaucracies of the state. And that isn't where I stand. And community archaeology is something that's just is actually public archaeology. Okay, so having got to that stage about talking to ourselves, which is what we tend to do within an academic community, I also wanted to consider, I also wanted to consider that when we talk about a public or engagement or communication, people do different things in different places across the world. Nobody's uniform. And I've just taken from this, but I think it's quite amusing, some work by Dr. Chiara Bonacci, who was looking at communication in archaeology some time ago. And she said I can borrow this tonight, so it's okay. And what she was doing was looking at the UK and she was looking at Italy. I don't want to get into this, but in Britain, museums, TV and the web are amongst the most widely used media for understanding archaeology, up to 65. Over 65, I don't know what happens. One of the most amazing pictures she came up with in her detailed research work with her data, which I still love, and which might explain part of the collapse of Time Team, is that she managed to isolate the audience of Time Team just before it closed as being very sad old blokes sitting in front of television screens, all aged over 40, who've been with the programme since the outset. And that's one of the reasons, because it's about audiences, yeah? But Italy is somewhat different in terms of how the public as a whole communicates. This is going to come on to another point I wish to make about talking to ourselves. And so engagement and behaviour experiences are different from different places. I'm sorry about this bit down the bottom.
Use the mouse too. Use the mouse and click 5.
How do I do that? Right, the right click. Hi. What? Sorry. Sorry. It's just interesting about how there are variations in how the public in different places perceive archaeology, which often, to a large degree, depends on what comes from the archaeological establishment, or if you like, the intellectual establishment. I don't know how to put that in there. Anyway, not to worry. But just as an example, which I find fascinating, we have in this country a thing called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which you will all know about. I regularly speak elsewhere in, I suppose, parts of the world. And I always commend the Portable Antiquities Scheme as being a brilliant idea for actually involving people with archaeology and sharing and opening access of information. And it's very interesting that in fact most of my colleagues in other countries, from China to Croatia, think it's a terrible scheme because it actually involves the public. And therefore it's really dangerous. And everything can be done through the state apparatus. I actually don't believe it can be, which is one of the things that I want to emphasise today. So to do that, to some degree, I'm going to borrow, that's all borrowed work tonight. I want to borrow some work from Dr. Anastasia Sakellariadi, who looked at how different communities in Greece look at archaeology. We'll make this very clear that this is based on large chunks of data. It's not based on a few interviews, by an unemployed social worker and 2 teachers who happen to be around at the time. This is detailed data research. He's taken 3 sites in Greece and asked simple questions, and there are a lot of questions. What advantages do you believe derive from the proximity of your community to an archaeological site? It's actually quite interesting because Delphi is the one which is most controlled by the efforts in Bureaucracy. So tourism is seen as quite a high thing. So archaeology is good for tourism. That's what people are interested in. That's what the public are interested in. She also asked, and I think this is again interesting, this is Greek, remember, in these 3 sites, which I could explain, but I won't have time tonight, although it's particularly interesting. How far do you feel that state bureaucracy influenced your relationship to archaeology, and if so, positively or negatively? Actually, it's quite alarming that these figures are very high. I don't think anybody's done surveys like this in the UK, but we don't have that same problem. But actually, basically, if you think not influenced and then positively and negatively, there's a very high count in some countries. Greece is just an example tonight. So archaeology being seen as a pretty nasty thing. And it's also to do with how we communicate. And finally, she asked, for whom do you think archaeology is practiced in Greece today, in your area, taking these 3 quite significant and important sites? And again, I think this thing is interesting because you'll notice that Credit Studio, then everybody thinks it's for the archaeologists. That says something about communication, talking of what we do, and how we get people to understand. There are some other features to pick out of this, but those are the things that I want to highlight when we think about what's happening in the wider world. Let's remember that the UK is probably, again, I can't produce data for this, is probably one of the most archaeologically educated populations, believe it or not, in the world, in all sorts of ways. It could all be down to the time being effect, I admit, but it's not just because of that, it's because of a long tradition. So this point about different parts of the world see archaeology in different ways, and have a completely different perception of it, which we don't normally make clear at a university level. Now, I have to do this to John, right? I really have to do it. Without data, without measurement, people can say anything they like. Right? So, they could the BMP or UKIP. I couldn't resist this because today I was on the University of York Archaeology Department website, and I had no idea until I looked at it that York is the UK's archaeological capital. I don't know what the hell it means. I have no idea. But my question would be, and it goes back to part of the business of talking to ourselves. When did it happen? How was it measured? Yeah, because these are the important things. I don't know how the Department of York measured itself as being the UK's archaeological capital. I'd love to see the data to support the claim. Then I'd be happy to accept it. And that drives me back to another point about why I'm an archaeologist. If I haven't got the data, I'm not interested. I can make as many nice statements as I like about the fast-moving war cozy, but I haven't got the data, I'm not interested. So congratulations to your archaeological capital. Right, so we're talking about communication. We're talking about talking to ourselves or not, and we do. I wanted to remind you that there's a whole series of sides to what we're doing. We are not, as archaeologists, free agents. What George Orwell said is absolutely right. He who controls the past controls the future. He controls the present, controls the past. What we actually give to people, I'm terribly worried about UKIP's archaeology policy, is going to be a problem for everybody. Because if we don't get that right, if we don't stand and say, we will have problems, I couldn't resist this. I'm sure you've seen this before, and we've just been discussing how to become a British citizen. I love this product, which is apparently something called the Home Office. And what I love about it is, when you buy British citizenship, you get a large picture of Stonehenge. Now, if somebody could explain to me, yeah, why that image is there, I would love to know. Yeah, I'm still trying to find out why they did. I'm really proud to be a British citizen, even though I don't particularly like the new arrangements at Stonehenge. Right, so, on the subject of order, and John did say I could sell my lights tonight in my 85, this will possibly give me 3 minutes. I also wanted to go back to another point that worries me a great deal in the field in which I work. Because whilst we're on the subject of George Orwell, who I will admit is a minor hero, the communication is important. Why are there courses on writing academic English in Sweden? Is academic English something different? When we write about archaeology, it's quite important. Orwell, in 1946, well, I still give these rules to my students, wrote how to write clear English. Yeah, I love it. I particularly like rule 2. Never use a long word where a short one or two will do. It's quite important. Because if we're going to communicate, what we do in the academy, as we're calling it, is actually relevant to the rest of the world, or there will be no job for it. If we cannot communicate clearly, we're absolutely done. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word. Mèche de forêt comes to mind when I'm talking about this. It's so meaningful to say, I just found a mèche de forêt. Yeah, to the average farmer, that means nothing. If you tell him to stone axe, it's okay. Right? So let's get that very clear. What we tend to do increasingly in the academy, partly because of the pressure of the things we're under, like the RAF, or RAE, or whatever, where everybody's constantly recycling the same data, is we tend to use things that actually mean nothing. I was trying to explain to a farmer recently about materiality. He nearly threw me off his land. Yeah? Because he doesn't know what materiality means. And if I spend a lot of time talking, he goes, oh yeah, it's just about different ways of seeing stuff then. Well, that's quite good. Anyway, so that's another area where I worry about talking to ourselves. So I thought I'd throw it all into my life. So just to give you a few case studies, or a few things that, the sort of things that interest me at the moment. Politics modes the class. Prevailing beliefs affect the class. Society in current fashion has an impact on how the class is viewed. So that affects presentation of everything that is presented or believed. Archaeology, as we all know, is not a neutral subject. We should be very clear about that. Actually, I was just thinking about how we explain the past in different ways. My favourite exhibition in the Museum of London is a Roman bit. Yeah, was the designer put all along the watchtower down the bottom. And you knew that was a Jimi Hendrix rewrite. So you could actually date it to actually when the museum was designed, just on the words that he used. Don't let's kid ourselves that it's something considered. Anglo-Saxons, yeah, you kids are obsessed by that, but Anglo-Saxons, there were no Anglo-Saxons. There were very few Anglo-Saxons, but we talk about it all the time. Yeah. So that language, even like Wheeler, when he was excavating Flowers Barrow, actually used the term Flowers Barrow that it was an Iron Age bridgehead, because actually Normandy was happening just before then, when we were invading. So when we use those words, it's quite important. And it's also important that we bear in mind the attitudes that underpin them. So what I wanted to say was, what we do, not only do we talk to ourselves, but we forget that wider world. Yeah? So nationally and internationally, we all use the past to create a past that suits different people, Anglo-Saxons or Celts or whatever. Yeah, we also use the practice of archaeology, and it is used all over the world for political ends. I'll come back to this case later. And sometimes on an even local scale, we do the same thing. And it's all that business about how we talk and deal with it that worries me. Now, I still think one of the most interesting features of current Republic of, China, the People's Republic of China, is the role of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong tended, and it's very interesting about where it happened within the political system, to create Chinese archaeology in an image that suited him and the Chinese Communist Party. I quite like it personally. I think it's really good. Yeah? So what you find is that you'll find political propaganda, which of course never happened in the United Kingdom, in China. I just want to raise quite I love China because it's quite, past ages demonstrate the unification of China represents an irresistible current, and all splitters trying to go counter to it are bound to fail. I like those sorts of quotes. It sounds better in Mandarin. Yeah? More importantly, and if you go to the Ming too, you'll see this stuff up written large. History written during the feudal businesses naturally reverse the truth that it is the masses of the people who create history. But we all know that it's okay to be like that. This whole point about who talks to whom and why, and under which political aegis it happens, and it doesn't. I think the UK is pretty exceptional in that it is not massively affected by these sort of things. Is very, very important when we consider our subject. Sorry, I mean, if ever you've been to the Great Wall of China, one of Mao's great quotes was, "Build a great China, build a great wall, build a great China." The PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army, is the Iron Great Wall of China. I can't think, but we haven't got one Stonehenge like that. But that sort of quote is really good. You get very close to it if you want to go British. And if you ever go, well, isn't that? I won't go on about the Chinese because I haven't all that. But it's interesting because we see this reflected, and I'm going to come back to Turkey, because I think Turkey's very interesting. We see this reflected in terms of nation building on a scale that we really need to recognise. Oh, I'm just thinking of the liberation of Scotland, because they're completely separate from us and they're completely different, aren't they, archaeologically? I think not. Anyway, let's think about Ataturk. Ataturk remains, Ataturk, nasty man in many ways. The Brits don't like it. Did a good job at delivery. But it's worth remembering that Ataturk, trying to create a new nation state of Turkey, went round and visited all the pre-Ottoman sites. This is the plaque at the site of the Spendos, one of the great Roman sites of Turkey. It's also worth remembering that Ataturk was actually a key figure in setting up the Turkish Prehistoric Society. Yeah? So don't let's get this idea that politicians aren't directly involved in archaeology. Don't let's get the idea that we aren't important in terms of what we can do in terms of understanding the past. I'm sorry, as a quick example, just to remind you, this is Aspendos, which is where that plaque is taken. I only showed you this because this is another point. When I went last year, I think it was, to give some advice, they have a huge theatre. I won't talk about it today, but it's very interesting. I was giving the guide to the site, which has gone out for the last 30 years. Yeah. And if you look at the guide very carefully, it's an interesting translation of it. Where it says M is labelled stadium, but actually M on the plan is the theatre. And where the stadium is, which is N, is labelled cemetery. And it's another point that I'm not going to deal with tonight, which is how we give information to people if we don't get it right the first time round. It's something that is really embarrassing. When I pointed this out to my archaeological colleagues, they said, well, we've been handing out for the last 30 years, nobody else has noticed. You're thinking, okay, so maybe we're missing a point about information. In fact, when I went round this site with two very distinguished archaeologists who I shall not name, I said, okay, so we're looking at public archaeology. So we walk into the forum, which is the bottom of the version, and they go, what's this? And they go, it's the forum. And I go, hang on, most people don't know a forum. They go, come on, Tim, it's the marketplace. So they went on this big sign which said Nim Player. Well, they tell me about it. What do you mean? Where are the things? Don't be stupid, it's a ceremonial fountain. So we got onto the Bureaucracy. Okay, I was the Northern member of the public. I'm not on the classic. Okay, Bureaucracy, and this is beautiful, because I knew what happened. I worked it all out. Why do you continue to use all these Latin words? And they said, no, Bureaucracy is Greek. I think you're missing the point, guys. If we want to communicate, let's be clear how we do it. Let's think, not about ourselves, but about everybody else. Anyway, so I've established the fact, and this actually relates back to the stuff I did from Greece, that the relationship between archaeology and its products and activities and the state is crucial. And we see this today as well. And it concerns me a lot that one of the other points about communication and what we teach people often goes through a process of what I would call state bureaucratization. We're not too badly touched with this in the UK, but you only have to go to several other countries where the archaeologists tend to be very close politically to the state, because that's where they derive their power through a legal basis. So they don't derive it through a publicly popular basis, or because they're interesting. It's because they've got a whole series of statute laws written down, which make the rest of the public's life difficult, which is of course why in Greece you have a relatively narrow negative view by the public of what we do, because we're controlling rather than sharing. We're talking about what we're interested in rather than what a wider public might have. So, let me just. So one of the points that is interesting is the way in which and why, let's get this real, why people are actually interested within a state political system, why they're actually interested in archaeology. And one of the reasons they should be interested in archaeology is the economic value of what we do, which is again something that we don't spend enough time looking at. I chose Malta because John Schofield's here. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is based, Malta's fascinating because they do have a lot of data. Yeah? This is about, I accept this is 5 years out of date, this is based on their data from 5 years ago. But basically they have something called the history and culture segment. God knows what they got that for. And basically, just going through all this, if you look at the Maltese economy, what analysis of figures demonstrates is that more than 2% of the GDP in Malta is derived directly or indirectly. That's a huge chunk of GDP from the archaeological product. My question would be, do the archaeologists get back 2% equivalent? The answer is no, they don't, because they don't know how to communicate the importance of what they do within that situation, because they've never worked out how to use it, because they can't communicate it very well. Okay, so I did Turkey earlier on, because I'm interested in Turkey. I'm interested in what happens in Turkey, particularly at the moment. I'm interested again in that political element of what's going on. Turkey is fascinating. I hope this isn't going to Turkey. But they have very full museums, and they are using archaeology in one of the most interesting ways I've come across. And I wanted to just introduce you to the work of Dr. Isle Kirsty, who is the BIA fellow in public archaeology stuff at this stage, because some of the work that she's been doing is very interesting in terms of the way that foreign policy and archaeology get together. Turkey is great because if you go, I'm sure you've been, it's a good place for a holiday. To actually leave the airport, unlike any UK airport, there is a notice saying, in accordance with whatever Article 58 of the Protection of Cultural Assets, metal coins, fossils, remains, etc., antiques, taking of cultural assets outside the country is forbidden. Violation of this law will result in imprisonment. We kind of work out how to get a number of people into prison sometimes. But the point I'm trying to get at is that archaeology is seen there as something which should be protected. You don't get notices like that at Heathrow. At least I haven't seen it yet. Yeah? And that's why we have a problem. So it's an interesting attitude with that. There's some interesting attitude in terms of what's important. I took this photograph, I think about 7 years ago in Turkey, while they were looking at the excavations of this huge Theodosian harbour. What I saw was all this stuff being reburied. You see the pottery coming out of some of the bags after it had been analysed. And I asked a stupid question, why are you reburying it? And they said, because we haven't got room in the museum and it's against the law to do anything else with it. And I said, in my usual innocent fashion, well, hang on a minute, couldn't you just put samples of pottery into little boxes and send them to schools in Turkey so that people would understand what the past looked like, so they go look out and no, we can't do that, it's against the law. And it's, again, that's about archaeologists within the state process and how they operate. However, going to the work of Mr. Restitution, I think it's particularly interesting. She's been looking, and has looked, and she's working in Anchor about, at this whole business of what's happening. And what's interesting is this is the Hattusa Sphinx, if that means anything, from one of the Hittite sites, which there it is in its theoretical position, which was looted, was acquired by the Germans, apparently quite reasonably, and went into their museum. And in fact, in Turkey, there's been this huge campaign, if you're all aware of it, I'm sorry to bore you, about the return of the material to Turkey. And it's a very subtle one. This is about the weary Heracles, bloke who looks very tired. Right? And what's more interesting, and this is why I'm particularly grateful to this lady, this is from her work, is that this is about the return of the Sphinx, or the Medusa Sphinx, as I call it. This is a front page from a Sunday newspaper, eat your heart out Sunday Times, right? About the return of this, where it says, you know, the statue's important, it's going back to Istanbul, right? The minister, this is the important thing about foreign policy. If the Sphinx is not restituted, all the excavation permits granted to Germany, including Medusa, will be cancelled. Yeah? And then it goes on about how it is carried over all the negotiations. And the interesting thing is that they were serious. And in fact, the Greek government has been involved in a brilliant campaign. You keep on asking why, yeah? For the return of material. And in fact, this will show you the impact that that campaign has had on restitution from foreign museums, not the British Museum yet, back to their country of origin. That in its own right is fascinating. Now, talking to archaeological colleagues in Turkey, and I want to be careful what I say here, they get very worried about it. So they go, no, we're above all this, you know. Fine in the British Museum, fine everywhere else. You know, why should the Turks have it back? What is this about the politics of restitution? There's obviously something else going on at the same time. But it's fascinating because you get now a series of speeches, this is back to the Medusa thing, where the minister says he's been looking after the culture of Turkey without discrimination, i.e. without religious discrimination. Whatever comes from Turkey's land, they're ours. And we keep them in custody for the whole of humanity, the souls of ancient artifacts in an unknown world. Let's just think about that. Who's actually getting the government to do this? Is it really important? Should archaeologists be involved in this because we're essentially a political theory? The answer is yes. And then the giveaway comes, which I think is also interesting in terms of what's happening in Turkey, where you see people saying, look, we've had a 25% increase in the number of tourists. Let's get back to the economic argument. It's never far away. Don't let's pretend it's not about economic. Right? And so that's all come out. The Bureaucracy Sphinx has brought, sorry, the new Sphinx brought prosperity. Sorry. And what I find interesting, and I think it's an archaeological matter, is the Samsat stelae, or is it the Antiochus stelae? The original claim for the return of this, it's a bit sad, isn't it, really? It's King Antiochus meeting Heracles, but unfortunately, at some point, somebody made it into an oil press base. That explains the large hole in the middle. Is that materiality? I'm not playing that. But we're going to go. Turkish government wrote, as part of this campaign, to say, you won't get licenses for excavation unless you return this material. So they demanded in specifically this piece. In fact, I think the delegation was over at the British Museum on the 18th of November. I don't know what the result was yet, but I think I can predict what the result will be. The interesting thing about the British Museum, is that since that request was made for this incredibly stunning piece, the British Museum have a view, and whose view is it, that materials should not be returned from the British Museum because it represents the thin end of the wedge. This isn't a matter for everyone to discuss. Does it represent the thin end of the wedge? I think in the case of Germany, having returned their two suspects, they were then confronted with another list. But it's also interesting that when you look at the response to this, most people here don't care about whether the Samsat stelae goes back. Few people in the British Museum do, and we're looking at a country that is emerging and becoming increasingly powerful politically. What should the attitude be? I'm really not sure, but that's the sort of thing we should be talking about as opposed to the type of statue. But what I find really interesting is that the British Museum have a response to this. And so they deliberately don't call the Samsat stelae the Samsat stelae, they call it the Antiochus stelae, because it's got King Antiochus on it, right? And I won't go through the whole thing, but you're welcome to look at it, because it's fascinating. This is the longest apology for owning something possibly potentially legally, but possibly not, I had ever seen. Yeah? And it's, I really love this, because it's the British Museum fearing, I mean, it can't fear on its own, can it? It's got to be somebody in the British Museum. Yeah? The safety of the site and the antiquities in the excavation process, paid guards throughout World War I. As we paid for the guards, we should have it, right? Well, up until 1923, when guards were expelled by Turkish troops, that was during the warfare, right? In spite of this, reports of damage were frequent. We're not sure what the damage was, but it'll do. Under the treaty of 1923, established on the case, the southern part of the Carchemish site, to which this stelae had been removed, you have to follow this to get the text, right? And the excavation premises of Jerusalem became part of Syrian territory. Oh, that's all. It's been moved into Syrian territory, so it's okay. Yeah. It's a very interesting point, yeah. And then it goes on, despite the destruction and looting continued to reach the peak in 1924, at which point Leonard Woody gained permission from the French authorities. Oh, it's okay, the British Museum was given it by the French authorities, so when it comes to Turkey, it doesn't matter. You'll read all through, let's look at the words, yeah? And so the point I'm trying to say, there can be no doubt the stelae, right, was acquired from Syrian territory. Yes, because it happened to be in Syrian territory at the time, yeah? I mean, it's a wonderful thing to start. With the permission of the French authorities, if the French government says it's okay, we got it. Yeah? And then in Syria, and therefore no Turkish law has contravened. Yeah? Missing another point about what these issues are about, and whether there are people in Turkey who are now saying, let's get the stuff back, we want it, and we want a foreign policy with. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. I wanted to take, because I mentioned it earlier, a couple of other examples very quickly about archaeology, how it's used, and the public. And if ever you've got time to look at the case of Sukinowa in 1953, which Don knows all about, sadly, this is an amazing excavation carried out in Japan, but it was basically a large parish council, really, where apparently the local people in the parish decided to list all the archaeology they'd got. And then when they finished listing it, they then continued to carry out an excavation of one of the first proper excavations of a large Japanese burial mound. And they did it. And they made a film. The film is incredible. If I had half an hour, I'd show it to you tonight because it's wonderful. And you watch this film and think, gosh, you can really involve the public in archaeology. It's perfect, isn't it? These are the local people doing their thing and carrying out an excavation. What you should also know is that the excavation of the Sukinowa tumulus is still one of the standard works on how to excavate a burial mound in Japan. So it's incredibly triumphant. When I saw the film, I was going, this is great, this is public archaeology at its best. The film was wonderful. It wasn't until afterwards that I realised that the film had actually been made by the Japanese Communist Party as an attempt to demonstrate that we're all the same under the sun. And in fact, the guy responsible is down there, Professor Kondo, who was a great Japanese archaeologist, a fan of Gordon Childs, and a Red. So my automatic question, after I saw this film, was, well, hang on, why weren't there more? And of course, there weren't any more, but by 1953, the Cold War was coming, and at all costs, the Communist Party and its adherents, archaeologists or not, had to be suppressed in order to take on the Russians and make Japan a bulwark against the Chinese and the Russians. So the whole archaeology changed. Those figures disappeared as well. And it's that point of archaeology that I think is so important. Yeah? Because although the excavation was totally professional, and it was run largely by the villagers, it was in fact a political propaganda exercise and should be recognised as such, and not as a great piece of public archaeology. Right, a couple of other things, just because then you can attack me later. Yeah? So I wanted to go through it. The museum's fascinating, because we haven't got room for all the stuff, and we will never have room for all the stuff. The whole series of issues that museums need to be involved with, and a lot of them cross over to this, again, this field of economics, but I just wanted to just give you one case study which I particularly love, about archaeologists and museums. And this is the famous Greek athlete from Loshi. Has everybody heard about the Greek athlete? It's a fantastic piece of Greek sculpture if you like making plates. I have no interest at all. But there you go. And this was dredged up from a small island in Croatia in 2004, I think, 2003. And I was actually fortunate enough, remember there were all those islands in Croatia, all the way down the coast. And it was dredged up, and it was restored by the Italian conservators and brought back to Zagreb. It's been to Zagreb, it's 400 kilometers from Loshi. Yeah, and it's a beautiful piece. And I, naturally, because I always managed to say the wrong things, I said to the then director of the National Museum, who was letting me stay in the guest room, why is it here, 400 miles, 400 kilometers from the coast? Why can't it be on display in Loshi? And his answer was, well, it's quite simple really, we know how to look after it. They're all peasants. And I said, well, but wait a minute, I heard that actually they want it back. He goes, yes, but they won't know how to look after it. All they want is an airstrip and tourists. They're staying in Zagreb. The interesting thing is, yeah, it's now back in Loshi. And they've got an airstrip. And it's in a special museum. And there's this point about archaeologists being involved in all sorts of ways. Actually, I got into trouble because I then suggested that if he was really worried about who should look after it, they should probably go back to Greece, because it was in the ship that got shipwrecked off Loshi on its way to Rome, and therefore the Greeks should have it really. Don't think I was invited back. So, just to wind up, because I'm approaching the end of my time and I'll be in trouble. One of the things that I worry about today is an ideal of global heritage. Whatever heritage means, I already have to go by it. So I think that, in a way, in the widest possible sense, archaeology is a form of science. And it was Tolbert who said, I think in the 30s, in the shadow of Nazi Germany and communist Russia, great Finnish intellectual, science should be free from dogma, from metaphysics, from national sympathies or antipathies. He's absolutely right. And yet in reality, even things like the so-called World Heritage Convention is actually loaded with spelt, with all those problems that Tolbert referred to in the 30s. They're all political. I'm fascinated by the World Heritage Convention. Western values, state parties nominate, it's about nationalism. Who gets the best deal? God, everyone should have. And who gets the best deal? And so on. And why don't we change it all the time? Because it's jolly good to have a World Heritage Site. I don't really care about it. This business about how we change the past, for me, and this point about needing to not only recognise it but talk about it, is represented by this museum. I went to the South African Cultural Heritage Museum in 1998 for the WAC operation. And I've never been to South Africa before. I think I've done various jobs spotting aerial photographs of West Bomb people when I've been at Cambridge in the 60s. But this was a real thing. And I went to the South African Cultural Heritage Museum. I went to look at the music gallery because I was quite into African music. And it was like walking into a 19th century European music museum. So I thought, I'll go and look at the costumes instead. So I went to the costume, it was like walking into Marks and Spencer's from the 1960s. And then I spotted this, and I was told not to break it up. This is all mine. This lovely photograph on the wall. In 1998, Mandela's out, the world is changing. Oh, it's beautiful. We are redeveloping the themes and displays in this museum to reflect more of our history in a cohesive and accessible manner. Some of the displays might seem to be temporarily out of context. This whole point about the way we deal with the past, and we don't talk about it enough, and we talk about it in the academy rather than the real world, is all summarised by that. Finally, because I have a bit of a problem, let us talk about the attitude to human remains. I really care. Who decides whether or not human remains should be treated with dignity? What does treating with dignity mean? Interesting. Who owns human remains? Do the Druids or the Christians? And what does honouring the aged have to do with it? I'm really concerned about this because Peter Archaeology, who I started off with, used to say, well, you know, you shouldn't display human remains because they don't do it in Australia. It's terrible. I think, well, hang on a minute. There was this survey done in the Museum of London during the display of London bodies, where none of you will remember this because you're all too young, but they had 12 bodies displayed from the Neolithic on mortuary trays through to the 18th century. Yeah. And I think it was Henry Swain did a survey, and if I got the figures right, 95% of the public who went to see it thought it was great. Yeah. 2% thought it was disgusting to display human remains, and the other 3% said there weren't enough bodies on display. So we have this huge ethical argument about what we're doing, and it's actually because we talk to the wrong people about what we do and about attitudes that vary regionally across the world. I just wanted to remind you that Mike Parker Pearson's big problem is let those we lay to rest, stay to rest, don't let them rob our graves. We've got to rebury them. His biggest problem is how to rebury bodies that archaeologists understand but nobody else does. And finally, just to make a point, because John was kind enough to mention Boynton, finish the book soon on it, about how we look at the past and what we believe. I can't resist this, I think it's very funny. I think the whole point about archaeology is learning to look, yeah? Learning to look. This is a portrait of William Strickland, the navigator. Don't worry too much about it. And he's described in the DMD as being the son of Roger of Mask, who was a sea captain, who introduced the Turkey to Britain. If you go to Boynton, you talk to people, they'll all tell you that's what happened. And actually, you don't need to look very far. But this is the portrait of William Strickland that hangs in the house at Boynton, which was painted, actually not by him. Nobody ever looked at this portrait, and I got a costume expert to look at it. William Strickland died in 1598. No costume on his portrait predates 1614. That may tell you something. Better still, in the background is Family Head. You all heard Family Head. And in the foreground is, and you won't see it very well, there's a Lubeck lugger, yeah, which is a little with it's got one sail, sort of thing that used to sail around, you know, the Baltic. And there's a little bloke in the back of the boat, and he's got something between his legs, and I promise you it is a turkey. Right? Brilliant, yeah? Complete creation of a myth in one go. Yeah? On the back of the portrait it says, William Strickland, who accompanied Sebastian Cabot in his early voyage of discovery of, in the naval uniform of the period. I know there was a naval uniform of the period, but never mind. Right, very quickly, William Strickland never sailed anywhere. He certainly never sailed with the Cabot. It's an entire invention, and yet, if we keep the myths running long enough, people will eventually believe them. And my concern, in terms of communication with the public about archaeology, is we get it straight and we tell people the truth rather than letting them get away with something soft and pointless. There is the sun falling over Mount Olympus. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you very much. And we always get depth and breadth with your presentations. And we had both there, which was wonderful. There's so many ideas that relate to stuff that we've been covering in courses here, PhD topics and so on. That was fabulous, thank you. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, and please feel free, if you wish to do so, to go and get a drink as well, if you want to charge your glasses and the top up, but do ask questions.
You don't get
I'm going to give you one, I'll ask the first question.
Okay.
Ask the first question.
Let's ask the first question.
Do you think archaeologists then are either, how do you categorise archaeology in general? Self-serving or politically naive?
Brett, sorry, I'm seriously.
Right.
Archaeologists are politically naive because they don't actually work out there is a wider world. I often think it's a bit like working in a museum. You go and hide rather than working out what you can do. So in that sense, I believe very strongly that they are hiding. They're politically naive. We are politically naive about what we actually do. One of the reasons is because we don't wind up, or we don't actually encourage people to use the skills they have within a wider world. So what will happen is so often you have an outside consultant brought in to tell you what to do to your archaeological site. Whereas in fact, if we train people to be good at business planning, which is easy, I mean business planning is easy, you do it off the computer, archaeology is much more complicated, then we can actually do it ourselves, and the people who do the archaeology will benefit and get the messages right. I think that would be my honest view, yeah? That was the first one. Now, you said self-serving. Yeah, well, I don't think we are. I think archaeologists in general are self-serving. The problem is they are frequently seen to be because they're not able to communicate what they do. I have a brilliant ex-PhD student who worked in Jordan. When he was doing the work looking at how the Jordanian people attached to archaeology, he pointed out that, you get an expedition spending £500,000 over 5 years, but none of the money went back to the local economy. Yeah? None of the things that were done that were right that you might well do here. There was no attempt to embed. And it's that naivety and that lack of thought, that lack of time that I think we all suffer from. No matter where you are. I mean, I know you're involved in the project now at Schadla-Hall, where I think one of the toughest challenges is to get the local people to understand how important their past is, because the indigenous people in Yorkshire don't always get it. But it's not. I'm not being rude. Some of my best friends, but it is important, and we don't actually think about how we communicate with those people. So I think they're both true. I think it's unfortunate. And what worries me, and it's underlying what I was saying, is this gap, which I think is there between the academy, if you want to call it the academy, and the real world. And if we want to demonstrate how important we are, and we are, then it can only be done by the invention. There has to be a about Turkey. Oh, sorry.
I apologise for the fact this is not an evidence-based question.
Yeah, I'm not interested.
When you're successful in your application to become Chief Executive of Historic England next year, how would you go about changing the culture of that organisation and the approach that archaeologists have, given that you have major control over resources, over grant aid, affect the rest of the sector, to actually deliver the ambitions that you're espousing? And do you actually think that can be done well at a national scale, or actually is it best done at a local regional scale?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike, that's very unfair question. Can I do two things? Because we have to do that. Yeah. And it goes back to archaeologists talking to themselves. Just as a backdrop to that, we are the first country, i.e. England, to flog off our national heritage. It's amazing. Yeah? We've also done it on the back of a business plan that will never, ever work. And everybody in this room who has any power as an archaeologist should hang their heads in shame that not enough people attacked it at the time they should have. Right. How would you do historic England? Yes. I think the only way, by and large, to make historic England work is to probably get local people to support what they do, to actually promote the sites at a local level for people and to involve people locally. I'm sorry, I've always thought this, because of the number of sites you have, which are incredibly important. And it's this, but it is this about, sorry, can I go on? Because you started. Things about communication is essential. You know, you have an inspector of ancient monuments who will just out to see a farmer in the middle of harvest and say, you're ploughing an ancient monument, you go away. It's not the right time to do it. Doesn't know why it's important, won't know why it's important, won't recognise it. I think that's, I really do, I mean, I've been watching what Invention have been doing recently. I mean, they've done some really good improvements on some of their sites. I went to Old Sarah. Old Sarah's been improved out of all recognition, but actually what makes it work is the local team is on it. Yeah, and I think that, you know, I've always felt that if you stopped having a centralised bureaucracy and you actually made it more localised and you got franchises locally, it would work much better. I mean, it's interesting again. Sorry, you raised it. God knows why you did it, but in fact, one of the problems that you face across much of Europe, and I don't want to say the English are different or the British, actually the British are different, but it does give real power to UKIP, but that's the last thing I want to do. We are different in that we tended always to have a soft hand on what you might call the national archaeology. It's never been too controlling. If you look at the rest of Europe, you know, where the Sophistendense in Sicily having a check, everybody's having a level time. Because it's state controlled and because there's no public sympathy. And it goes back to my point about different populations in different places. You know, the Italians are different to the British. And I think the British get it better. And if you were actually going to be really imaginative, I think what you do is you go for a much more localized structure where the public were involved. Sorry, that you asked, I'm sorry, not very good answer.
Yeah.
Hi, so this is quite a lot in line with what I'm doing my PhD project.
Never mind.
Yeah. And so I have 3 areas that I'm concerned with.
Yeah.
Firstly, archaeologists that engage with politics. How do you do that? Because if you've never been a politician, if you've never had, you know, the sort of green or activist mentality before, and where do you go to start that ball rolling with politics? You know, where do you go to start engaging? Secondly, communication. That can be sort of a lot more difficult than, you know, it's not a simple thing. You can't just suddenly start talking to people and expect results.
I always do.
Okay. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe you expect, yeah. And then the third thing is engaging with the local community, especially with the sort of communication aspect. One of the things that grabbed me when you were showing us the graphs of people who said that either archaeology was even positive or negative, was like not influenced. The not influencing is a real problem. Think about it, because people are wanting to engage. And that is another thing that I've, you know, some of the work and some of the people I've spoken to in New York sometimes find that it is the lack of interest. So is it a case of us having to sell ourselves, or sell the archaeology, you know?
I think you're worrying too much. Can I do with those in reverse very quickly?
Yeah.
I think you worry too much about the latter one. I can remember some time ago when excavations at, I can't remember the name of the site, the site in East Anglia, where everybody goes and digs. Sedgefield, yeah. I once got an undergraduate to do some survey work on Sedgefield about the villagers and local people who were involved with it. And they came back and said, well, it's been a failure. Only 30% of them have visited the site. I said, hang on a minute. If 30% of them have visited the site out of, you know, a notion of 100%, that's more votes than the Tories got in the last election. Yeah. So then let's worry about percentages in terms of 80%. Yeah. Let's worry about the Labour 35. And what people miss is actually how big that is, not the fact it's got to be 100. Sorry. So, I really think if you're hitting 30% of the population, yeah, you're doing a brilliant job. Yeah. Sorry, it's fact. Yeah. Just think about political votes and how they work. That's that one. On the matter of communication, I think. Sorry, I mean, I've spent a lot of my life with politicians, because I think I turned up to Parliament when I was about 14 to find out what's going on. You could walk in those days, you didn't need a car, you didn't need a machine gun. my advice is most politicians are interested in archaeology. The largest, well, it was certainly 2 years ago, all-party parliamentary archaeology group is the all-party parliamentary archaeology group. Sorry, the largest all-party parliamentary group is the all-party parliamentary archaeology group. He's the secretary, talk to him. I mean, you can actually, it isn't difficult. Go and talk to people. Politicians will be interested. More people are interested in archaeology than you would believe. It's just they don't know how to come into contact with it. And if you want to talk, I mean, James Dozer wrote a PhD about archaeology and politics, which you can get online if you haven't seen it, because he used all my best contacts for it. And I mean, I've got to be careful what I say here tonight. I was quite involved in stopping the first passing of the Treasure Act, which I could talk to you off the record, but I'm not going to do it in public because I don't want to talk about that. But how it works is relatively simple. And my view about politicians is there are an awful lot of good politicians who will be involved, both at the local and national level. When I was director of museums in Leicestershire, I was amazed once you started talking to local elected members, how many of them found it fascinating for different reasons. Okay? And it's just a matter of talking to people. It is not a barrier. You should be confident about what you do, because what archaeologists do is interesting. That sounds a bit sort of, let's go for it. But we can talk about it later. But I think it's true. I think we seriously underestimate.
Right at the back.
He's not allowed to ask questions. Sorry.
No, you spoke earlier about the understanding of material culture, and you mentioned London and diversity in understanding. Do you believe that probably because landowners are sometimes more in contact with archaeological sites, etc., they have a greater responsibility to understand the material than either local politicians or local midwives or the chap that works in the pickle factory? Do they have a greater responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, seriously. I was giving a lecture on Saturday night on the Great Royal Valley, which you all know about, because you're just not far away on the world, and I was talking about the archaeology of it. I was actually raising money for the church. I got 1,000 quid for the church. I got nothing as a fee. But that's not the point. But there in the audience were lots of farmers, and they come along, partly for other reasons. They all came to me afterwards, I went 5 of them, and said, oh, I've got this site, I want to dig it, I've always wanted to know, what are you going to do about it? And there's a huge number of people, and landowners in particular, who don't know, because nobody ever talks to them. They'll get their label about it's a Schedule H monument, and then they won't go any further. And I'm being anecdotal, but one of my favourite Yorkshire farmers, who I've known since he was about 5, who collects archaeology from his landscape and actually talks to other farmers, once said to me, when I walk across our fields, I now realise I've only been here a few seconds, really, in time. And if we can get people to understand that, that's what we'll really do. So I agree with you. And the landowners don't always get a chance. I mean, you've got that great case of John Browning, who is still alive, who, the Icklingham bronzes, does that mean anything? You know the story, the Icklingham bronzes? These bronzes got looted from a Schedule H monument and sold to the Dean and White, quite illegally in the States. Colin Renfrew ran a major campaign to get them back. And John Browning went to English Heritage and said, are you going to help me get these back to the United States of America? They said, no, we don't do that sort of thing. John Browning had to carry out his own court case in the States in order to try and get them back. And I think, landowners and farmers are pretty good. They're much better than people give them credit for that sort of thing. And what they lack is people actually telling them. And actually telling them clearly. And they've got more questions to ask than anybody else. So that's my view. That may be coloured by my long experience of the Yorkshire world, which they may be different elsewhere. But I don't think it's true. I mean, I've been working in Hampshire recently, where I think it's about 2,000 acres, and the farmers desperate for me to dig more. Don't tell anybody.
So do you think that you come into contact by nature the ones that are more interested, that there are a lot that actually don't care and don't want further investigation, just don't look for things, etc.
Right.
And is that the majority?
No, I don't think it is, you see. I mean, I'm sorry, I was doing a favour for Martin Billick recently, talking to farmers about doing a survey. Yeah, I won't tell you where it is, but it's on the world. And the third farmer I went to see, I arrived, the other two had been only too happy. The third one I went to see, and his partner was there, and I said, hello, I am an archaeologist. And she said, whatever it is, the answer's no. I'm not making any of this up, sorry, this is honestly true. Yeah? And you need to really go, because it makes the point. I'm like going, really? And anyway, the reason the answer was no was because she had problems with the archaeological bureaucracy in Humberside, and therefore all archaeologists were useless. And actually interesting because it goes back to the point I was making about the bureaucracy earlier on. Yeah, that was it. And in fact, one of my favourite farmers on the Yorkshire, when I told him the story, he said, do you mean your charms failed? But it's not true, because most farmers I know are only too keen. Seriously, it's a matter of getting known.
I mean, cruising it up.
Just an observation more than a question. For my sins, I'm involved with Malton Museum.
Oh dear.
And
I stole the stuff from Warren Percy years ago. Yeah, right.
yeah, well, it's back at the English Heritage Archaeological Store because in 2012 we actually had to close the museum.
I know.
For voluntary run. But what's been really interesting since then is the determination of the volunteers who run the museum to keep the museum alive. And what we've been doing is actually taking artifacts out to different groups. And I sat last week with some Samianware. Nothing very special, just chunks of reddish pot, excuse me.
Yeah, very shiny pot, yeah.
I'm not an archaeologist, but it was really, really interesting to see how these elderly women, first of all, loved touching it, loved the tactile stuff, the ideas they were coming up with in terms of how people would have bought it. I mean, things that I certainly have considered. And I actually think we're going to revive the whole of what we got there on the back of community involvement. I just wanted to.
You're absolutely right. People should be allowed to touch things. It's fine, you know. But it's a big thing about don't touch. I mean,
Oh no, they.
that opens up museum display. Same thing. No, well, good luck to Bolton.
Yes, Colleen.
Actually, that was really inspiring, really interesting. Does UCL have like a teaching assemblage, or some assemblage that they're able to go, to go to the community with and actually bring that out? Because I think that's really interesting. And we have, I did my PhD at Berkeley, and so we have a mandatory outreach component, but that requires us to do 20 hours of outreach as PhD students each semester. And so how you interpret that and do it, you have to register, report it, and go out. So I think you've got a lot of experience with that. But that also involved a teaching collection when we would bring assemblies out. Do you have something similar, UCL?
I think the Museum of London does it very well. We have, it's an interesting thing about collections, isn't it? Because we're far too precious about our collections. I speak as an ex-museum director. But yes, we do. But I think the whole point about archaeology is tactile. Yeah, and it's very important. So yes, we do. But the Museum of London does a very good job. And in fact, that whole business about taking stuff out is very important. I mean, there is so much archaeology that is never going to be seen by anybody. I don't want to sound like Cornelius Hawthorne today. But, there is,
No danger.
he once threatened to kill me. That's only because it took a long time to write a paper ago. But I think the point, you're absolutely right, there's no point about communication. Yes, it's about collections and handling and stuff, or actually even talking to people about stuff. But also, it just reminded me that one of the things that really surprised me when I was in Japan, again, Don will know this, is that all undergraduates who do archaeology in Japan have to do gensetsu, which means they have to go out and explain the archaeological site to the general public. We don't do that here. Yeah? You know, anybody I think who gets a first degree in archaeology should learn to communicate to the public. Same thing again. Is that right? You're right. It's fun telling people what a metaphor is.
It helps you understand it.
We're going to start winding up a little bit. If anyone has any final questions, burning questions, or what?
You can attack me, it's all right.
You must be attacked.
Any closing questions anyone would like to ask? No?
Can I? Sorry.
Steve?
There seems to be a sort of contradiction in part of what you're saying, because you're clearly suspicious of state bureaucracy. And then when we come to talk about engaging politically, you talk about walking the corridors of power with elected representatives, which for me isn't politics. So how do those two things fit together?
Yeah, sorry, perfectly fair question. I hope it's not a contradiction, but what I find interesting about the relationship of archaeology to the state, and it's particularly clear, I think, on the continent, but also elsewhere in the world, is that archaeologists can go one or two ways about what they do. If they align themselves to the state, which in the majority of cases archaeology has done. I think the UK is an exception. So, say in Japan they have, certainly Italy in the past they have. Certainly on many of the European countries, they are very much closely aligned to the state. So it gives them, they can see power through a bureaucracy which they can create by being close to the state apparatus. So if you remember, I think I'm right in saying, I hope I'm not misquoting, Geoffrey Wainwright was horrified when English Heritage was moved from the DOE, which had total power over planning and everything, to DCMS, because he saw it as being a downward movement, because control of archaeology was slipping away politically. So there are, and I'm not characterizing Jeff in that sense, because he's still alive, but this point about being close to the state, to the state bureaucracy, is very different, I think, from actually talking to politicians about archaeology. So the reason I say that is because, and again, I'm not the person to do this. You probably remember that, well, maybe you don't, maybe you don't. In the last parliament that went out, there were more members of parliament signed an early day motion to make sure the funding, I'm checking with Mike, but to make sure the funding for Portable Antiquities scheme was kept going, and signed the early day motions trying to break the war in Iraq. But I think the maximum number of MPs signed that early day motion that could, who weren't ministers. And that wasn't the bureaucracies of the state doing it, it was the politicians. And if you look at the Portable Antiquities website, they're really clever. I think they put all the antiquities for each constituency up on a website now. That's not appealing to the state, it's appealing to politicians. I think there is a difference. Does that make sense to you? Or?
It makes sense, but I don't agree with it. I mean, I think do you really think that MPs voting in Parliament are powerful?
Well, you see, the trouble is, yeah, I do. I want them to be. Sorry, more powerful. I think state bureaucracies are really dangerous. I think it's far too much. So that's why I'm an optimist. I'm still an optimist. I'll continue to be an optimist. Sorry, and I think it's true.
It's not a question of optimism. It's a question of where you think change comes from. Does it come from talking to MPs, or does it come from engaging with people in their localities?
Oh, well, both, because if the politicians have a road geographically, that's what they're engaged with. So if I could, yeah, that's what I think. I mean, I can only be anecdotal about this. One of my favourite MPs actually a story.
I'm sorry, you can't allow yourself to be anecdotal.
I know. That's what I said earlier. I'm sorry, yeah, but very quickly, very distinguished ex-minister, Tory, joined the All Parliamentary Archaeology Group very early on. And he was returning his son to school, and the housemaster came out and said, "I'm so pleased to see what you've done." And he said, "Oh, you've been my speech about the export of illegal whatever." He goes, "No, you joined the All Parliamentary Archaeology Group." And that's how we got lots of people to join it. Sorry, so that's my answer. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one.
Just a comment really, that
Well,
back up on that
Yeah.
last point is this, you know, the idea of state bureaucracy is dangerous. And
Well,
that might be how we think of politics sort of writ large, but I think when we think about Malcolm Cooper's work, he talks about how people who are working in heritage and archaeology, you know, working as part of the state, are operating in quite a critical sort of environment, but they often don't recognise it themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's the sort of danger with how we're polarising those activities, you know, is that a lot of what people are doing is quite political, not in terms of class politics, in terms of sort of power relations, if you like, and that kind of gets lost in what we
It may well get lost, but in the majority of cases, I mean, my favourite soprintendenza in Italy left the soprintendenza because she said she was fed up with the way the system worked. She did far more damage to the outside because the state system is full of people looking after themselves. Like, it takes a lot of nerve to walk outside. I think it's better to be outside than inside. I'd rather be right and in the minority and wrong and with the majority. Sorry, that's it. That's your
Yeah,
right.
thank you very much. Thank you all very much for supporting yours over the course of this term. We start again, I think, in week 2 of next term. All right, you first time? Yeah. Ollie Morgan. Great. Okay, so we'll see you next term. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Entertaining. Yeah.